Emily's crutches clicked softly against the wooden planks of the old riverside pier. A faint whimper cut through the darkness. Following the sound, she found them, Jack, the wounded veteran, and Rex, his loyal dog, both lying unconscious, their bodies covered in blood near a rusting boat. In that moment, Emily realized she had stumbled upon something far bigger than fear. She had found the beginning of a secret that could change everything. Before we dive deeper into this powerful story of courage, compassion, and silent heroes, I would love to know, where are you watching from today? Drop your country in the comments below, subscribe so you never miss these stories of hidden bravery, and may your day be filled with hope and kindness. The river lay silent beneath the weight of night, its waters sliding past the banks with a muted hiss, the mist crawling low and thick over the decaying wooden planks of a pier long abandoned. Once, boats had come and gone from this place, unloading goods and carrying people across the dark current, but now the only signs of life were broken ropes, rusted hulls, and the distant call of night birds. It was in this silence, broken only by the lapping of water, that Jack, a 42-year-old veteran with broad shoulders and tired eyes, walked slowly with his companion Rex, a 5-year-old German shepherd whose sable coat gleamed faintly beneath the pale moonlight. Jack carried himself like a man used to danger, his gait steady but heavy, as though each step bore the weight of years of battles and losses. Rex walked ahead, nose low to the ground, ears pricked, his every movement taut with focus. He had been trained once to track and protect, his loyalty sharpened by long service, and though he now lived far from the battlefield, the instincts had never left him. Jack trusted him completely. He trusted the dog more than the silence of the night, more than the shifting mist that seemed to hide something waiting in its folds. When Rex stopped suddenly, growling low in his chest, Jack felt the muscles in his neck stiffen. He followed the dog's gaze toward the end of the pier, where faint lights flickered through the fog. There, clustered in the ghostly glow of a lantern, stood a group of men. They were rough, their coats heavy, their postures sharp with caution, and before them lay several crates stacked carelessly on the boards, the sound of wood scraping and the metallic clink of hidden weapons carried across the water. Jack knew that sound. He had heard it in war zones, when contraband and guns passed hand to hand under the cover of night. His chest tightened. He crouched, signaling Rex to stay close, and began edging nearer, his eyes narrowing as he tried to see through the haze. The pier groaned beneath his weight, the boards swollen with years of rot. Jack froze, willing his breath quiet, but it was too late. A sharp crack split the night as one plank sagged beneath his boot. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence, echoing across the river. The men turned at once, their lantern beams slashing through the fog, catching the glint of Jack's eyes. For a second, there was stillness, the frozen tension of predator and prey, and then they moved. Boots thundered on the boards as they surged forward, faces twisted in fury at being discovered. Jack tried to retreat, but they were on him in moments. A heavy fist caught him across the jaw, sending him sprawling against the railing. Before he could recover, another blow struck his ribs, sharp and brutal, driving the breath from his lungs. He staggered, blood seeping into his mouth, the taste of iron strong against his tongue. Rex sprang with a snarl, his body slamming into one of the men, teeth sinking into the thick sleeve of a jacket. For a moment it seemed the dog might turn the tide, but then a boot caught Rex's side, and another man swung a length of iron pipe, striking hard. Rex yelped, a sound that cut through the night like a knife, his body collapsing onto the boards. Jack roared, trying to rise, but another strike landed against his temple, blinding him in sparks. Pain seared through him, hot and dizzying, his vision swimming as blows rained down. His body folded beneath the assault, blood smearing the weathered wood, the pier itself seeming to breathe with his ragged gasps. Finally, his limbs gave way, and he collapsed, his chest heaving once, twice, before darkness overtook him. Beside him, Rex lay trembling, his breath shallow, one leg bent at a sick angle. The men cursed, muttered, and glanced about nervously. One spat, another kicked Jack's body to make sure he no longer moved. And then, deciding the job was finished, they retreated quickly, dragging their crates toward the waiting boat that bobbed at the edge of the pier. Within minutes, The fog swallowed them whole, the sound of oars fading into the night until only the river remained, carrying away the secret of their presence. Silence returned, broken only by the rasping breaths of a dying man and his wounded dog. Not far away, in a small weathered shack pressed close to the riverbank, lived Emily, a 5-year-old girl whose life had been marked by a cruel accident that cost her one leg. She moved with crutches now, the soft click of metal against the floorboards a constant rhythm in her fragile world. Though young, her spirit carried a resilience far older, shaped by hardship and the quiet strength of survival. That night, as the storm of violence played out unseen, she sat awake, staring at the shadows that danced across the cracked walls. Then she heard it. A faint whimper carried on the fog, so fragile she thought it might be her imagination. Her heart raced, small hands gripping her crutch as she rose. The sound came again, weak but desperate, the cry of a creature in pain. Compelled by something she couldn't name, Emily pushed open the door and stepped into the night. The damp air wrapped her like a shroud as she hobbled across the uneven ground, the noise of her crutches echoing softly against the silence. Step by step, she drew closer to the pier, fear tightening her throat until she saw them. A man sprawled motionless, his body streaked with blood, and beside him a great dog, trembling, eyes glassy with pain. Emily gasped, her breath hitching, her small frame frozen in shock. For a moment she wanted to turn and flee, to hide from the nightmare laid out before her. But then the dog's eyes found hers, pleading silently, and she felt something stir deep inside. She spun on her crutches, voice breaking as she screamed for the only person she trusted. "Grandma Clara, come quick!" The sound tore across the fog, urgent and piercing, until a light flickered from the shack behind her. Clara appeared in the doorway, a lantern clutched in her weathered hand, its flame trembling in the draft. She was in her 60s, her dark skin lined with years of struggle, her shoulders stooped but still strong. Once, long ago, she had served in the military, and though poverty had reduced her to a shack by the river, her eyes still carried the sharpness of discipline and the depth of hard-earned compassion. Seeing Emily's terror, she hurried forward, lantern swaying, until the scene at the pier came into view. Her breath caught, but her steps did not falter. She knew the look of wounds meant to kill, had seen it before in deserts and jungles, and something within her snapped into place. Setting the lantern down, she bent, sliding her arms beneath Jack's bloodied frame, straining with every ounce of strength left in her aging body. "Help me, Emily," she whispered hoarsely. Together, with the determination of the frail and the wounded, they dragged Jack from the pier, Rex limping weakly behind, until the battered bodies crossed the threshold of Clara's home. The night swallowed their trail, the river keeping its secrets for another day. The shack's door slammed shut against the damp wind, its hinges creaking like tired bones as Clara and Emily dragged the battered weight of Jack across the uneven floorboards. The faint glow of Clara's lantern carved trembling shapes on the cracked walls, filling the small space with shadows that clung stubbornly to the corners. The air inside smelled of river damp and smoke from the hearth, and now it carried a sharper scent, the metallic tang of blood soaking through worn cloth. Rex stumbled after them, his paws leaving faint smears of red against the rough boards, his breath shallow and ragged, his amber eyes dulled with pain but still locked onto Jack's broken form. Clara laid Jack down near the fire, the old rug beneath him instantly darkened by the spreading stain from his chest. Her heart pounded, but her hands did not falter. She had been here before, decades ago, when she was younger and in uniform, when young men had bled in desert sand and jungle dirt. The motions came back to her like muscle memory. She tore strips of cloth, heated water in a battered kettle, and pressed the first cloth hard against Jack's wound. Blood seeped through almost instantly, but she pressed harder, whispering to herself, not to a god she no longer believed in, but to the stubborn spark of life she hoped still burned inside the man. Emily hovered beside Rex, her crutches discarded against the wall as she sank to the floor, both arms wrapped around the dog's trembling body. She buried her face in his matted fur, tears streaking her pale cheeks, her voice a small broken chant. "Don't leave me, doggy. Please don't leave me. Stay with me." Rex gave a faint whine, lifting his head with effort, resting it against her shoulder as though trying to comfort her, even as he shook from his own wounds. Clara glanced toward them, her lips pressed tight, and then returned to the task at hand. One life at a time, she told herself, one wound at a time. She found her old tin box of supplies, relics from years long past, a bent needle, coarse thread, alcohol that smelled as harsh as fire. Kneeling by Jack, she worked quickly, cleaning the torn flesh at his shoulder, forcing the needle through skin that was warm and slick beneath her fingers. Jack groaned faintly, his body stirring, but his eyes remained closed, lost in the fog of blood loss and pain. Clara's face was lined with concentration, sweat shining on her forehead, her hands steady despite her age. She whispered instructions to herself as if the voice of her younger self still guided her. In deep, tie it tight, hold steady, soldier. When the wound was bound and the bleeding slowed, she turned to Rex. The dog's leg was bent at an unnatural angle, the fur torn where the pipe had struck. She moved with equal care, washing away the dried blood, wrapping the limb with firm strips of cloth. Rex whimpered but did not fight her touch. Instead, he pressed his head back into Emily's lap, surrendering himself to the care of the two who now fought for him. Emily stroked him gently, whispering through her tears, "You're a hero. You saved him. Now let us save you." The sight broke something in Clara's chest, but she forced herself to remain focused, to finish what needed to be done. The fire crackled low, the only sound against Emily's quiet sobs and Rex's strained breaths. Jack stirred, his head rolling slightly to one side, lips moving without sound at first. Then, with a rasp that seemed torn from deep within, he spoke. Weapons? Smuggling?" His words faltered, but his eyes fluttered open, cloudy but determined. Clara leaned close, catching every syllable. "I saw everything," he whispered, before collapsing back into a haze of weakness, his breath shallow but present. The confession struck Clara like a stone. She had suspected something dangerous, but hearing it confirmed by a wounded veteran made the reality unavoidable. Clara sat back on her heels, her lantern casting long shadows across her lined face. She understood immediately the danger. Men who dealt in guns and blood money would never allow a witness to live. If they discovered Jack had survived, they would return, and this time they would leave no one standing. She looked to Emily, her small face buried in Rex's fur, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs, and a chill slid down Clara's spine. She had taken Emily in to protect her from the world's cruelty, and now the world had come knocking at their door. She clenched her fists, her decision forming even as fear tightened her chest. Emily lifted her head, her blue eyes glistening with tears, and looked at Clara. "Is he going to die?" she whispered. Clara forced her voice to remain steady. "Not if I can help it, baby. Not while I still have these hands." Emily nodded, though her lip quivered, and bent again to Rex, whispering her promise to the wounded dog. Clara placed a hand gently on the girl's back, drawing strength from the innocence that refused to give up. It was then she resolved that she would keep both man and dog here, in her home, until they could stand again. She would not abandon them to the river or the shadows that lurked beyond the pier. The night deepened, the lamp flickered low, and Clara worked on in silence, checking Jack's pulse, changing the bandages, stoking the fire to keep his body from the cold. Every creak outside, every whisper of wind through the boards made her flinch, but she pushed the fear down, burying it beneath the discipline of survival. Emily drifted into an uneasy half-sleep against Rex's body, her tiny arms still wrapped around him as though she could hold life itself in place. Clara watched them, her heart tightening. These three, one child, one soldier, one dog, were now bound to her by blood, by chance, and by something greater she did not dare name. By dawn's first light, faint and gray against the frost-coated window, Clara finally allowed herself to breathe. Jack's chest rose and fell in fragile rhythm. Rex's eyes opened just enough to meet hers, and Emily stirred with a soft murmur, clutching the dog closer. The shack was still, the danger outside momentarily held at bay, and Clara's decision remained firm. She would guard them here, mend them as best she could, and pray the shadows at the river's edge would not return too soon. The flickering lamp had not gone out, and neither had hope. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a weak glow across the cramped shack, its heat barely enough to push back the damp chill seeping in from the river. Jack lay propped against the wall, his breathing steadier but still ragged, his face pale and drawn. Clara sat close, her lantern light framing the deep grooves of her features as she pressed him for answers, not with force, but with the quiet insistence of someone who had seen enough to know that silence could be fatal. Jack's lips parted, his voice gravelly yet edged with urgency as he began to speak. He told them everything, halting at times but determined. The men at the pier were not drunkards or petty thieves as one might mistake in the fog, but members of a network that ferried guns and dirty money under the cloak of night. The river was their highway, the abandoned pier their station. Boats came and went when the mist was thickest, carrying crates too heavy for anything but weapons. He had seen the exchange with his own eyes before they had turned on him, and he knew enough to guarantee they would not stop until every witness was silenced. As the words left him, the room seemed colder, the threat no longer a shadow, but a presence breathing outside their walls. Clara listened in silence, her eyes steady though her stomach clenched with unease. She had heard such truths before in faraway lands, whispers of cartels and smugglers that cut through the lives of villagers like blades. She did not flinch now, though her mind churned with calculations. If Jack was right, and she had no reason to doubt him, then the danger was not a passing storm but a tide that would rise again. Emily watched quietly from the corner, her small hand resting on Rex's head, her wide eyes darting between the adults, sensing truths too heavy for her age but refusing to look away. Jack's voice cracked as he leaned back, exhaustion pulling at him. "If they know I'm alive, they'll come." The words hung in the air like smoke, clinging to their skin. Clara nodded once, firm, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Rest now," she said. "Leave the worrying to me." But inside, her mind was already turning, reaching into old instincts, recalling the drills and the strategies she had thought long buried. She could not fight them head-on, not with her age, not with a wounded man and a child under her roof. She needed to act wisely, and she needed to act soon. When Jack finally slipped into uneasy sleep, his breath shallow but even, Clara rose. She reached for her old coat, pulling it tight around her shoulders, and took the battered mobile phone she kept tucked in a tin box under the bed. The phone was old, its screen scratched, its buttons stiff, but it still held a signal when the night was quiet enough. She stepped outside into the fog, the river breathing heavy in the dark, and dialed the only number she trusted. Her voice was low, measured, as she relayed the details. A wounded veteran in her care, smugglers using the pier, crates filled with weapons, danger closing in. The officer on the other end asked questions, and she answered briefly, her words clipped, until at last she closed the phone and tucked it away again. She did not go back inside immediately. Instead, she stood by the edge of the shack, staring into the mist where the pier loomed faintly, its rotting boards invisible beyond a few feet. The night hummed with silence, but she could not shake the feeling that eyes watched from the trees, that the shadows themselves carried whispers. Her heart thudded heavy, but her resolve only sharpened. She had called for help, but help was never fast in places like this. Until it came, they were alone, and it was on her to keep them breathing. With a final glance at the river, she turned and re-entered the shack, her lantern flame flaring against the sudden draft. Inside, Emily had crawled closer to Jack, her small frame curled by his side, her tiny fingers gripping his larger blood-stained hand. She looked up at Clara with eyes too solemn for her years. "He's going to be okay, isn't he?" she asked softly. Clara set the lantern down, brushing Emily's hair gently. "We're doing everything we can, child." Emily nodded slowly, then leaned closer to Jack, whispering as though her words might slip into his dreams. She told him of her own fight, how she had lost her leg but refused to lose her spirit, how she still wanted to run, to live, to laugh even when others looked at her with pity. Her words wove through the room like a fragile thread of hope, and though Jack did not answer, the faint tightening of his hand in hers spoke enough. Clara watched the scene in silence, her throat tightening. She had seen soldiers cling to life with less to hold on to, and here was a child giving strength to a man twice broken by war and violence. She knew then she had been right not to tell them of her call, not to share the weight of what she had done. Jack needed rest, not more fear. Emily needed hope, not shadows lurking at the edges of her small world. The truth could wait. For now, the lie of safety was a shield strong enough to hold until morning. The fire popped softly, sparks floating up to vanish into the smoke, and the shack fell into uneasy calm. Clara sat in her rocking chair, the lantern at her side, her eyes never leaving the door. Her body was tired, her hands still stiff from sewing wounds, but her mind stayed sharp. She knew the game was not finished. The men would return, and when they did, she had only this fragile home, her wit and her will, to stand between them and the lives she had taken into her care. She breathed deeply, forcing the tremor from her chest, and whispered to herself, "Not while I draw breath." Dawn was still hours away, and outside, the mist clung heavier, swallowing the outlines of trees and water alike. Inside, 3 lives lay bound together by chance and danger. The soldier, the child, and the dog, each scarred in their own way, each depending on the quiet strength of an old woman who had once sworn never to fight again. Clara's eyes narrowed as she leaned back, her hand resting on the lantern's handle. The storm had not yet broken, but she was ready. The night had sunk into a deeper silence, the kind that carried more weight than calm, when Clara felt the change in the air. She had been sitting upright in her wooden chair, the lantern glowing faintly at her side, while Jack slept fitfully against the wall and Emily dozed curled up beside Rex. Outside, the river whispered beneath the fog, and then the sound came, low at first, then swelling into something unmistakable. The steady hum of an engine, muffled by mist but growing louder as it neared the shore. Clara's back stiffened. She knew without looking who it had to be. The sound cut across the quiet like a blade, followed by the grind of gravel and wood as a motorboat nosed against the old pier. Heavy footsteps disembarked, multiple men moving with deliberate weight, their boots striking in rhythm against the soaked earth. Shadows shifted just beyond the shack's thin walls. A sharp beam of light slashed through the window, sweeping across the cracked boards and throwing Emily's frightened face into pale relief. Then a voice, harsh and guttural, cut through the night. "Old woman, hand them over, or die with them." Emily jerked awake at the words, terror surging through her small frame. She clutched Rex desperately, her arms wrapping around his thick neck, her cheek pressing into his matted fur as though she could shield him with her tiny body. Rex stirred, ears twitching despite the bandaged wound on his leg, his body tense though weakened. Jack stirred too, forcing himself upright though his face was ashen, his jaw clenched in pain. He reached blindly for the broken length of wood Clara had left by the hearth, his hand trembling as he lifted it. His chest heaved with effort, but there was fire in his eyes, the kind of fire that refused to surrender even when his body was close to collapse. Clara rose slowly, her lantern in hand, her gaze hardening as she stepped toward the door. She had no weapon but her will, no armor but her resolve, but her presence filled the small room with a gravity that even fear could not erase. She pulled the door open just enough for her voice to carry, and in the face of the blinding flashlight beams outside, she did not flinch. "If you want them," she said, her voice steady as stone, "then you'll have to step over my body first." The words hung in the air, heavy and defiant, and for a moment the night seemed to pause, holding its breath. Outside, the men muttered to one another. Their shapes shifted in the fog, tall figures in dark jackets, faces obscured by shadows, but movements sharp with impatience. One barked a laugh, cruel and mocking, the sound scraping against the shack walls. Another struck the door with the butt of a weapon, the wood groaning beneath the impact. The shack rattled, and Emily whimpered, clinging tighter to Rex as the dog growled low, the sound vibrating weakly in his throat. Jack leaned forward, sweat dripping down his temples, gripping his makeshift club as if it were the last line between life and death. Clara did not move. She planted herself before the doorframe, her frame small, but her stance immovable. "You think I fear you?" she asked, her tone sharper now. "I've seen men like you before, and I buried them with my own hands. You will not take them while I still draw breath." Her words landed like stones against steel, not breaking the siege but forcing the men outside to falter. One cursed, another growled, and the sound of boots crunching closer signaled their intent. They were circling the house now, surrounding it like wolves around prey. their beams of light cutting across the walls, searching for a weak point. Emily pressed her face into Rex's fur, whispering frantically through her tears. "Don't let them take him. Don't let them hurt us." Rex answered with another growl, faint but steady, his head lifting, his amber eyes burning dimly but fiercely. Jack shifted his weight, wincing as pain knifed through his body, yet he pushed himself higher, bracing against the wall. He caught Clara's gaze briefly, and though his voice was barely audible, the meaning was clear. He would not let her stand alone. Clara gave a small nod, her throat tight, her heart racing, but her resolve unshaken. The men outside grew bolder. A shoulder slammed against the wall, rattling the window panes. The door shuddered beneath the pounding of fists and weapons. The shack seemed to quiver with each impact, its thin structure groaning in protest. Clara raised the lantern higher, her shadow stretching across the wall, her voice ringing out once more. "This is my house. Step inside and you'll face me first." The lantern's glow flared in her eyes, making her seem taller, stronger, as though her years had melted away and the soldier she once was had returned to stand guard again. The night thickened with tension, every sound magnified, the crunch of boots circling, the snap of twigs underfoot, the labored breathing of Jack, the muffled sobs of Emily, the low growl of Rex. Yet beneath the chaos lay another silence, one the intruders could not hear. The call Clara had made hours earlier had not gone unanswered. Somewhere beyond the mist, the thrum of engines stirred, the faint crackle of radios whispered, and officers moved swiftly along the riverbank, their weapons ready, their eyes trained on the shack. None inside the fragile home knew, but help was cutting through the darkness, closing in with every passing second. Within the shack, however, that truth was hidden, and fear pressed heavy against the walls. Clara's knuckles whitened around the lantern handle, her body braced against the door, every nerve prepared for the final breach. Emily clung to Rex, Jack raised his trembling weapon, and the shadows outside loomed closer, their lights glaring through every crack. The air was suffocating, thick with dread and defiance. And in that breathless stillness, the old shack became a fortress of fragile courage, its frail inhabitants bound together, waiting for the moment the storm would break. The shack trembled with the pounding fists of the men outside, the lantern flame quivering with every impact, when a new sound broke through the night. It came sharp and rising, a piercing wail that cut across the fog like the cry of some vast horn. Sirens, high and unrelenting, echoed along the riverbank, bouncing off the dark water with a fury that froze the intruders in their tracks. Then beams of blue and red sliced through the mist, washing over the broken pier and the rusted hulls, flashing against startled faces as the sound of powerful engines roared closer. A patrol boat surged into view, its lights blazing, its wake crashing hard against the pilings. From its deck, uniformed officers rose with weapons trained, their radios crackling, voices calling commands with the authority of men who had been waiting for this moment. "Police! Drop your weapons! You're surrounded!" The air shifted, the hunters becoming hunted in an instant. The men who had circled Clara's home hesitated, their bravado dissolving under the sweep of gun barrels and the glow of searchlights that tore apart the shadows they had relied on. Panic erupted. Some bolted toward the pier, their boots hammering the wet planks, only to be met by officers storming from the boat with practiced speed. Others dove toward the tree line, but the glow of flashlights and the shouts of lawmen drove them back into the open. A scuffle broke out, fists thrown in desperation, but each attempt ended quickly, arms pinned, bodies shoved to the ground. Within minutes, the fog was filled with the clatter of handcuffs snapping shut, the bark of orders, and the muted curses of men who knew their freedom had slipped away. At the water's edge, another group of officers clambered aboard the smuggler's boat, prying open crates stacked in the hold. Metal gleamed under their lights, rifles, pistols, ammunition. Beside them lay bundles of cash, damp but unmistakable, the very lifeblood of the trade Jack had stumbled upon. One officer, broad and square-jawed, barked into his radio, confirming the seizure, his voice tight with triumph. "We've got them, weapons secured, funds seized, all units, perimeter contained." Inside the shack, the chaos outside carried a different weight. Jack pushed himself upright, his hand pressed to the bandage Clara had sewn, his breath ragged but his eyes alive with determination. With a trembling hand, he reached into his shirt and pulled out the chain around his neck, the silver dog tag glinting in the lantern's light. He raised it weakly, his voice hoarse but firm enough to carry. "Veteran, I'm no enemy here." Emily, who had clung to him throughout the ordeal, found her voice then, her fear melting into a burst of raw defiance. She cried out toward the officers just beyond the door, "He and this dog saved me!" The words struck harder than any blow. An officer pushed through the doorway, his flashlight sweeping across the scene until it landed on Jack's battered face, the silver tag in his hand, and the small girl gripping him with tears streaking her cheeks. He lowered his weapon, his expression softening. "You're safe now," he said firmly. "You're not suspects, you're victims in this." Relief flickered in Clara's chest, though her posture remained taut, her eyes scanning each officer as if waiting for some hidden deception. The rescuers moved with efficiency, lifting Jack onto a stretcher brought in from the patrol boat. He resisted at first, his body straining to stay upright, but when Emily caught his hand, he relented, his eyes locking onto hers. His lips curled into the faintest smile, pained but genuine. "You," he whispered, "you're the reason I'm still breathing. You kept me alive." Emily squeezed his hand, her small frame shaking with sobs, her eyes shining with pride. She did not answer in words, only pressed her forehead to his, their bond forged in blood and survival. Rex whined as the officers turned their attention to him, the dog's legs still wrapped tight in Clara's makeshift bandage. A medic crouched, running skilled hands over the German shepherd's trembling body. "He's hurt, but he'll make it," the medic muttered, signaling for a stretcher of his own. Emily leaned close, her lips brushing Rex's ear, her voice a trembling promise. "You're still alive. You're not leaving me." The dog's tail thumped weakly against the floor, his amber eyes brightening just enough to reflect the hope in hers. Reporters would one day call Clara a heroine, but when the officers tried to thank her, when they praised her courage in facing armed criminals alone, she only shook her head. Her voice was calm, but edged with finality. "I did what any human should, nothing more." Her gaze lingered on Emily, then Jack, then Rex, and she said no more. For Clara, the night had been about survival, not glory. She had lived long enough to know the world did not need her name in lights. It needed decency, quiet and unwavering, to exist at all. The first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the fog with hues of gold and gray. The river shimmered with the reflection of patrol lights fading into the distance, the smugglers long taken away, their weapons locked down, their empire broken in this place. On the battered pier and the weathered shack nearby, peace settled at last. Jack lay in the ambulance, Emily at his side, Rex beside her, Clara standing silently as the sun touched her worn face. The story ended not with triumph shouted to the world, but with the quiet truth that heroes are sometimes nothing more than an old woman with a lantern, a child with a crutch, and a loyal dog who refused to stop fighting. At the end of this story, we are reminded that true courage often does not shout, but whispers through small acts of compassion and quiet sacrifice. A child with one leg who refused to give up, an old woman who risked everything to protect strangers, and a loyal dog who fought until his body gave way. All of them showed us that heroism is not about recognition. It is about choosing kindness even when it costs us something. Their strength reminds us that the world is held together, not by power or wealth, but by those who silently give of themselves for others. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments, let us know what is on your heart, and subscribe so you never miss more stories of hidden bravery. May God bless you and protect you and your loved ones wherever you are.